I'm Andy Schmuckler. I'm going to speak in a way that people might think they're listening to somebody who's basically a partisan. I actually have a history of being sort of transpartisan. At least, I mean, I've leaned in a particular direction in general. Uh, the the bent of my thinking, but I've placed a high priority on um, bridge building. In the 1980s, I was associated with a DC um, good good little institute called Search for Common Ground, and I was invited as a speaker to certain kinds of events that you know the people who believe in make love not war might invite somebody. Second half of the 1990s, um, having done a lot of radio, I went around the country delivering a talk. In some cases, it was a sermon. Unitarian churches a lot, World Ethical Society. I called it Beyond Dispute, and I said that the two sides of our polarizing country really should fight less and have dialogue more, seeking that higher wisdom in which the apparent contradiction between the two sides' half truths might get integrated. I really believed in that. It was it was in a sense a spiritual quest of mine to trying to bring together. It grew out also of my doing radio here in the Shenandoah Valley, where I talk with people on the other side of the divide about all kinds of things. And I wrote a book, which is also like right behind my head. I've got, except for the parable of tribes over there and what we're up against over there, my other books are just on the shelf behind me. But there's a book which came out from MIT Press in 1999, and the subtitle. I don't want to give the title. Well, I'll give the title. That's a story. I had to yield on the title. I don't like the title. Debating the Good Society, that's the title. I was going to call it Loose Threads on the Cosmic Loom. I don't know what you think of that title, but I don't like this one. But anyway, the subtitle is A Quest to Bridge America's Moral Divide. And it's cast in the form of dialogues. Different characters are created. It's not till well into the book that I admit to the reader that the thing is written as a fiction, which is something that I enjoyed doing. There was a time in my life when I wanted to be the American Dostoevsky, and I tried my hand for a while. I loaded trucks to get enough to pay the rent, and I wrote fiction, and I ended up very unimpressed. But in the context of this book, A Better Human Story, not A Better Human Story, Debating the Good Society, there is a fiction created that is subordinate to the exploration of ideas, but not terribly subordinate. I like it. I hope somebody will read it. Anyway, it came out from MIT Press in 1999. So I am not, by character, a partisan. There occurred a change on the right that I felt required a change in my stance. I figure our repertoire can't just consist of one way of being. And where I felt like I had in the 1990s found the conservative base out here in the Shenandoah Valley to be unspoiled. That they actually were talking in good faith. By the time I became embattled rather than a bridge builder, a war wager, was when interacting with the people here meant interacting with people who were dealing in bad faith. So they no longer were expressing things that the people who inculcated those beliefs really took seriously themselves, like good Christian values and stuff like that. But they were inculcating the politics of falsehood that I talked about earlier today. One destructive lie after another. When I discovered that if I was going to talk with them, I was going to be talking essentially with a position of bad faith, even if the people believed it. I stopped to talk with them. Well, first I tried to find good ways of doing it. It became that radio station, by the way, that used to be substantially call in. They felt obliged a few years back to abandon that whole notion. They wouldn't put it this way. They're basically a right-leaning group, but there's too much craziness out there in their audience. The audience that this station fed 3 hours of Rush Limbaugh to for every day for years, and a few hundred hours over 10 years of me on the radio. But it's not the party of falsehood is not a party of good faith, and the conservatives that I used to really feel a real affection for. It was an unusual time in my life. I'm not sure I fully understand myself in that time, but I reached the end of certain roads, and I was also into questioning more some of my ideological assumptions. So I really appreciated a lot of these people, and when I experienced them being swept up in this politics of falsehood, I mean, there'd always been some of that politics of falsehood in this. I mean, when it came to talking with them about the Confederacy, that was challenging. The lie has been a part of this culture for a few centuries, I guess. I don't know how much racism dictated that. I think another thing which dictated it was that the political economic system of the South emerged in such a way that there were very early on very large gulfs between the richest and mightiest few and the common people. I think that played a role also in developing the politics of the falsehood. I mean, it's hard to deal with the Confederates around here in view of the continuing success of the politics of falsehood on that issue. It's just they started lying a whole bunch of false things to lure the poorer whites in by saying that Southern honor was at stake, which is, it was their money and power that were at stake. The whole honor thing was just a hook to grab people from, I guess, largely Scots Irish. I'm guessing, I mean, there's a book that I read for Out of Weakness called the the military, the ethic of honor in Southern pre-war Southern society, or something like that. Wyatt Brown is the author. It's in the bibliography of my book, and it shows that I think if what I'm remembering is that a lot of the people who settled the South were people for whom the idea of honor um, was important, and important in the way that if it is insulted, you want to fight whoever insulted it. You know, so there's the ethic of the duel among the Southern aristocracy. And there was, this is a bit of a conjecture on my part, but I believe it's true. There was a susceptibility in the widespread Scots-Irish settlement of that part of the continent, a susceptibility to being lured into something with somebody waving the banner of our honor is at stake. I don't know enough about the Scots-Irish to know, but I think that there's that there. There's a book that I used in teaching American history about like 4 different settlement areas. I'm not remembering the book, but one of those was the Scots-Irish. You know, you got the Puritans up there in New England, and we've got the Quakers in Pennsylvania. Here in Virginia, there was a big influx of the Cavaliers when Cromwell turned the tables. Those who had been the refugees that came to power, and those who had made refugees of them, the Cavaliers, came to Virginia, etc. Very early on, the political force that operates in the South, which is a pretty coherent thing. And you might note that a remarkable thing happened in the last 55 years, or almost 60 years, excuse me, since LBJ signed the civil rights legislation. What had been the solid Democratic South became the solid Republican South. Now, the Democrats are working on breaking that solid thing. There really was a switch. I mean, a switch that it was exemplified by individuals like Strom Thurmond, who had been, you know, the quintessential segregationist Democratic leader. He became eventually a Republican. Less flamboyantly, Trent Lott, the Democratic senator from Mississippi, became Trent Lott, the leader of the Republican caucus in the Republican-controlled Senate, if I remember correctly. There is something in the spirit, the political power of the South that's maintained a kind of cohesion. And we saw it move like a house being dragged down the street from the Democratic side to the Republican side. And I think we can also see that it moved through the generations more or less intact, and emerged in the Republican Party of this era. I was talking before about the slave power run South seceded from the Union because they didn't like the results of an election. Results that they had brought about by their own fanaticism and elitism and insistence on everything being their way. Part of the brokenness is that they were so much into domination that even Stephen Douglas's appeasement wasn't enough, and they split the Democratic vote and brought Lincoln in, and they were willing to simply assert a right that the President of the United States said they did not have, which is a lawless act. They didn't take it to the Supreme Court. They just said, we are going to claim that we have this right and act on it. They had no such right. The Supreme Court might have said they had a right if they did this or this or this. I don't know. But for sure, they didn't have a right to secede the way they did. An act of lawlessness rather than submit to the results of a legitimate election conducted according to the rules that we have all agreed as Americans to abide by. Now, what does that remind you of? The 2020 election is a lot like the 1860 election in that the same spirit that drove us to civil war, well, I don't know if I want to go there. Trump does not seem exactly of that cloth. He's got his own unique flavor. I don't know if it's New York, but he is such a remarkable person. I don't see him as an extension of the ugliness of the slave power. But his father was a member of Ku Klux Klan, so family culture certainly admits of this ethic of domination and racial bigotry, which was at the core of the slave power. You know, the slave power was really quite proud of itself, though it claimed that a major spokesman in a major speech just months before the Civil War broke out declared quite openly that this white supremacy on which the Confederacy was founded was a noble moral principle, and that the natural position of a black man was to be the subordinate of the superior white man. That was called a cornerstone speech. Alexander Stephens, who became the vice president of the Confederacy, delivered it, and it was a major deal. But the politics of the lie kicked in immediately after the Civil War. There's an article in the New York Review of Books in 2012 about how the lie about what the South had fought for emerged immediately after Lee surrendered to Grant. I don't know quite why it was such an important thing for them to lie about, since they'd been so proud of it 4 years before. But they lied. The article was written by James McPherson, who's sort of like the premier American historian of the American Civil War, and was now in his late 80s. And this was some years ago. I wrote to him and asked him, well, why did they lie about it? And he did answer, but I still don't quite understand why they lied about it. But that's one of the things which gets carried into here. I mean, I can understand why they made it out to be the noble cause, like states' rights. Maybe they figured that if they wanted to hold the poorer Southern whites, best to trade in this slavery thing that they'd been so proud of 4 years before, because that had been lost. The Constitution had been amended, and but you could hook them in. If you talked about states' rights, I mean, here are people who have been trampled on by a lot of bluebellies, and who had a resentment of how much had been destroyed and their defeat. And sure, they'd love to imagine that what the South was about was states' rights and don't tread on me. At least I'm speculating. I don't really know how it happened or why it happened, but maybe that's it. But the people around here that are still believing Oh, I got somebody calling into the radio show talking about the war of northern aggression. Now, I've just said that the secession of the South was something they were not authorized to do. It was an unconstitutional act. It was a crime. Lincoln had a constitutional duty to confront the insurrectionists. I think he saw it that way. And he wasn't going to, he was a man of the rule of law. He was very explicit to the South that he had no designs on slavery where it already existed. He didn't think he had the constitutional right. It was only a matter of how much that empire would expand. And to accept that there was going to be a limit to the expansion of the slave empire was to accept the idea that this slave power that had given us most of our presidents, most of our speakers of the House, most of our Supreme Court justices from 1879 to 1789 to 1860, that was going to have to accept that the center of power in America was going to shift. Lots of people have lost power over generations and centuries. But this one was so bent upon domination, as you might expect about something that was basically about slavery. You know, Thomas Jefferson wrote something very powerful about slavery. Yeah, he's the guy who wrote, all men are created equal. The guy who penned the Declaration of Independence. And he's the guy who supported himself with the help of slaves his whole life. And even then couldn't live within his means. Not the most admirable characteristics of this extraordinarily brilliant, creative, visionary man. I remember JFK making the joke at some state dinner party. I've never seen so much intelligence in the White House since Thomas Jefferson dined alone. But he's the guy who, didn't walk his talk. His own selfish desires were so insistent that he couldn't accept sacrificing his privilege that rested on slavery. But he did write a passage that was, I think, impactful in the society, about the terrible effects on a human being's character of having the kind of power over another human being that a slaveholder had over his slave. And he describes quite well some of the ways in which that corrupts the spirit and creates a tyrannical impulse. That tyrannical impulse was a powerful element in the spirit of the South that was run by these slaveholders, a comparatively few people with a lot of power and a lot of the South's wealth. So they created a culture of the lie that before the war deceived people into thinking that their honor was at stake, and after the war deceived people into thinking that their resentments of their defeat could be channeled in a righteous spirit about they're the victims. They brought it upon themselves. It was the South that declared war illegally. I sometimes have wondered whether if I had been on the Supreme Court and the South had brought some argument about their right to secede, how would I have ruled? Because I tend to sympathize with independence movements like the Scots and to some extent the Catalans in Spain and the Slovaks. If they wanted to be independent of the Czechs, okay, I sort of was for that. So maybe the South would have persuaded me, but they didn't have the right to do what they did. They did that as criminals. They did that as people who are so much into domination that they couldn't accept what the democratic process requires that people accept, which is that sometimes you lose and the other guy gets to have the power. Well, that's the same spirit that constitutes a fair amount of the Trump power that we're up against. I mean, Trump is a separate phenomenon, I think. But the people who could be manipulated into believing that their interests were at stake in preserving slavery, in spite of the fact that it was really a system that kept them poor and weak. That kind of ability to deceive people got built into a political system, and there are cultural patterns that can move through history. And so this is yet another way that you can envision the reality of what it is that I say exists in the world and can reasonably be called a force of evil. And that is, you can see a pattern, a structure that moves through the society over time, so that, like in the Shenandoah Valley, very tightly, the Confederacy is a tightly woven part of the same spirit that gives us the Trump party. You know, the January 6th crowd walked through the Congress waving some Confederate flags. Some people have made a big deal out of that. Even throughout the whole Civil War, that never happened. Well, out here, the same people who are going to vote for Trump and the Trump party are people who rose up in righteous indignation when the school board decided to stop naming all of our schools against Confederate military heroes. My kid would have gone to Stonewall Jackson High School, living where we live right now, if we had not taken a junket to New Mexico, where I would teach and he'd get free education in a first-rate independent school. It wasn't my idea, it was my son's, but I did what I could, and we had the adventure we had. Anyway, I haven't been a partisan. I just saw something rising on the right. I saw something that can be seen in a whole lot of ways, and one of the ways it can be seen is by looking at the rogues gallery that the Republicans have put before us. I'm not saying that every single major Republican figure that's been on the political stage has been a rogue, but a very high proportion. I spent a fair amount of attention looking at Rush Limbaugh and what the spirit was that animated him. He's not somebody I would want in my family. He's not somebody I would accept in my circle of friends. I don't approve of what he is. I respect that he had capabilities, but one thing I've learned is you can be very capable and aligned with evil. And our religious traditions have never thought that evil was incapable. I was at first taken in by Newt Gingrich. I believed at first, when he first became speaker, I was a bit conned by his ability to talk in somewhat conceptual ways. As I'm into, ideas and such. And so, he had been a professor of maybe his American history or something like that. He knew how to he knew how to wrap something up in a cloth that would look to me like maybe something I might respect. But pretty soon he showed what he was. And then the ultimate big ticket he got into the Rogues Gallery was when I found out that the same Newt Gingrich, who had spoken about Bill Clinton's dalliance with Monica Lewinsky in the way that he did, was at the same time being way more dangerously unfaithful to his wife, having a considerably more serious affair with somebody not his wife. To be able to do what he did on the floor with Clinton while he was doing that told me that there is a complete sociopath there. He definitely, at that point, I'm thinking, he's as bad as Limbaugh. Maybe even worse. And then Karl Rove came on the scene. I read stuff about what he had done before he was, sort of Bush's brain, governor of Texas, and there's Rove. The history showed this guy to be, I wouldn't want him as a friend. I mean, I respect, the guy's smart. He's a fine propagandist in the politics of the lie and the manipulation and ways of getting people to do things against their interests. Belongs in the Rogues Gallery for sure. And around that same era, this fellow, Tom DeLay, was the Hammer, I think they called him, was operating in the Republican part of the House. He was a thug. That's how I see him. I think the law tried to rein him in at some point. I don't think it was successful. But he was a thug. With respect to W, I think he's a person who's not integrated. I've never understood him because I don't know quite how to put the pieces together. For one, on the one hand, well, I'll start with the nice guy we see since he retired. I mean, he really behaves in a way that I don't find objectionable. Sometimes I've liked the way he's behaved since he was president. And the way he acts now, I don't wonder, as I did when he was president. Is Laura Bush a different person than I thought she was? And if she is who I thought she was, what is she doing with this guy? But I never did get a solid handle on him. I'm not sure if I'm ready to put him in the Rogues Gallery. But this is a guy who, when the war in Vietnam was going on, was not only willing to let his dad pull some strings to spare him from being ever in harm's way. And I can understand that temptation. I was interested in not getting drafted when I got my draft notice in 1968. I didn't do anything illegal to get it, but, I did what I could. But he not only utilized his privilege as being the dad of a guy who had been, at that point, what are we talking about? He was the chairman of the Republican Party. I think it was before he was appointed Nixon's ambassador to the United Nations, but it was around those times. He was an important guy. He was moving on the executive. He had been in Congress, I think just for one term or something, but he was moving up by occupying these important. And he got his son assigned to this thing having to do with flying military aircraft. But not only did he get that, which meant staying away from Vietnam, he also failed to fulfill his commitment. He got the cushy place. Nobody would shoot at him. And then he skipped out on his duty. Now, I don't know that the evidence still exists, or even when it existed, it was sufficient to prove that in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt. But there it was, and I think it was pretty well established. And he was also the guy who was willing to choose a sociopath like Karl Rove to be his political manager, and to make the hero, John Kerry, who got wounded in Vietnam and played a somewhat heroic role, swift boat him to turn him into the coward, and then have video of that mission accomplished nonsense with Bush looking like the buff fighter pilot getting off on this battleship or aircraft carrier, whatever it was. So I don't see Bush clearly. I think there's some lack of integration. And it does bother me that people don't remember, if they ever knew, they don't seem to remember that he did a lot of very ugly stuff as president. It may have been at the goading of the Dark Lord Dick Cheney, or it may have been with Bush's brain, Karl Rove, but he did it. He was the one that got those guys around him. So he probably belongs in the rogues gallery. But what I like to see emerging is that this rogues gallery shows that the Republican Party is a place where a certain spirit is in control, and that expresses itself in human form in the various people that become its prominent face. So, for example, I'm not going to hold against the Republican Party that a guy named like Hastert, who was Speaker of the House for a goodly while for the Republicans, turns out to be a child molester. I don't know that that's a reflection of the nature of the Republican Party, that they would have done that, but it could be. Could the Democrats have done that? I mean, Hakeem Jeffries, Nancy Pelosi, I don't think that they would have that kind of thing in their closet, but I've been surprised. I don't hold that against them. But when we do get to Mitch McConnell, for example, I've watched this man at work for a very long time. And I got to tell you, I feel some pity for him, because either because of the episodes he's lately had that injured him, or maybe those episodes showed that he was already falling apart, but this guy's kind of falling apart, and his hold on the Republican Party is falling apart. But he's been leader of the Republicans in the Senate for a very long time, and I think his performance has been disgusting by any values that would be held by any of those guys on Mount Rushmore. The way he stole a Supreme Court seat is disgusting. The way he became proudly pronouncing that the Republican-controlled Senate was a place where legislation went to die, regardless of whether it was good for the country or not. He definitely belongs in the rogues gallery. He's not grotesque in the way that Trump is grotesque. I mean, Trump is such a florid, like a one-man exhibit of all human defects. Mitch McConnell is just this small soul that sees the whole game just in terms of winning, getting his way. That's true of Trump too, but along the way, Trump enacts a whole lot of other stuff. I mean, he doesn't have any control over his other impulses. McConnell is disciplined. Trump can't control his greed enough to not sell parts of the presidency while he's president. Not enough to be the most powerful man in the world. Got to get foreigners paying tribute at the hotel a few blocks from the White House. Jeez. Not enough to be the most, to have more say over where the country goes than anybody, but to make a fight out of everything just to show his dominance and have no interest really in accomplishing anything for anybody's good but himself. I mean, do you think I'd put Trump in the rogues gallery? I think Trump makes the word rogue really quite inadequate. I mean, we've seen in the movies a whole lot of rogues, but nobody's ever seen anybody like Trump that I can think of. I mean, I think about the Joker, in the Batman movies, or let's see, what was I trying to? Who are the evil people that we've seen? I mean, I recently saw Shane, which I've mentioned before, and Jack Palance plays this, sort of. But anyway, the rogues gallery. These are most of the faces that have been really prominent in the Republican world, and we could look at adding some of the people who have become prominent faces of the Republican Party, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz. Ugly. And then you look on the Democratic side and you say, well, is that just the way politics are? No, that isn't just the way politics are. I think most of the Democrats that have been at center stage are quite decent people. I'm not saying they don't have their personal defects, but I'm not sure they have any more defects than the average person. And when I think about it, I'm willing to say that there's probably more goodness in Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama and Joe Biden and Hakeem Jeffries and Elizabeth Warren. Go through the list, and I don't think you're going to find people who belong in any kind of rogues gallery. They actually, I think, for the most part, are allowed to wear white hats in the Western. I know one politician well enough to feel like I know I can say about Tim Kaine, my senator here in Virginia, somebody I've had occasion to interact with in the wake of a speech I delivered in front of him, and in a subsequent event, and watching what he's done. I don't think he was a particularly effective vice presidential candidate against a ticket like headed by Trump, but he's a really, I think, outstandingly fine human being. And I think most Democratic prominent faces in our era have been mostly really pretty good people. I mean, I can think of, what's that, John, the guy who is Kerry's running mate, senator from North Carolina. Anyway, it turned out that he was having an affair while his wife was dying of some disease. It was it broke in the tabloids. He had some kind of a civil suit or trial or something. John Edwards. Okay. And you can't say that, I think that Bill Clinton was a rogue, sort of like the Tom Jones in that Best Picture of the Year in 1960 couple, the Tom Jones, played by Albert Finney. He's sort of, for the most part, sort of a lovable, a rogue in the lovable sense. Though I'm unsure about whether, I mean, there was an accusation of something like rape in the case of Bill Clinton. I kind of not believed that. But, there have been certain reasons not to dismiss it, too. So I don't know. If that were true, then he goes out. He leaves the Albert Finney being the hero of a picaresque like Tom Jones. But I hold against Clinton was that he should have known that his enemies were gunning for him, and he should have had the self-control not to take any chance at all. I mean, the enormous responsibility that he had. The sexual aspect of it aside, I just have difficulty forgiving. Or I forgive. I cannot respect that he was a person who couldn't take his responsibilities seriously enough to control his wandering libido for the good of hundreds of millions of people in the United States and around the planet. He gave his enemies an opening to try to destroy him. Fortunately, they overplayed his hand, but I don't know. I think that if he hadn't done that, and if Clinton had been able to complete his second term, feeling and looking as good as he had before that broke, I mean, our economy was in great shape. The stock market had soared. We were running budget surpluses. We were in good shape in the terms of peace in the world. We were still the world's one remaining superpower. It looked pretty good. By the time we get to the election of 2000, with Al Gore going up against W, I think that there was a price paid because Bill Clinton didn't have the, as was said in some teenage circles reporting what their dads told them, keep it in your pants. Well, I don't know if that makes him a rogue, but it makes him less than admirable. By the way, I also do really admire Bill Clinton. I heard him give a speech for Obama at the end of my campaign for Congress in Roanoke in 2012. I was so impressed. I mean, he is very, very smart. He did a marvelous job. And I think he basically stands for things that are good. He's an opportunist, but politics is about playing the cards that you're dealt, and you don't always know what the consequences will be. And he did have the effect. I mean, it seemed like the liberals were just in disarray after Mondale in '84, and then Dukakis in '88, and then came Clinton in '92, and seemed to stop the game moving closer and closer to the end zone with liberals backing up and backing up. He backed up some. I don't know if he backed up too much. And he instituted some things that weren't so great, like having to do with crime. But he did stop the erosion, and he put liberalism back on the map to compete against conservatism, just as after Hoover in '32, when Roosevelt gets elected, the Republicans were reeling for a while the Democrats controlled the presidency from '32 to '52. So I have a mixed feeling about Clinton, but he is really, really, really smart, very capable. But the Republicans are different. And the fact that if we put up however many Republican faces. If some AI were to rank what faces are the most representative, the face of the party, starting in 1990 all the way up to the moment, I think that the majority would be very much would belong in the rogues gallery. And I say that that means that that's a manifestation of the spirit that controls the Republican Party. I think we get a reading about that spirit looking at those human faces. Because when we look around and we see that the Republicans are doing this on this issue and they're doing this on this state legislature, and there's just hundreds and thousands of things that go on all the time. This about the Ukraine thing. Sometimes we can read that they're all making things worse. That's one way of seeing what's going on there. But another one that's really connected rather deeply with ourselves is that we can see people. I mean, long before we had concepts like the rule of law, we had people seeing people. And if you see, it does require sometimes listening to what they're saying, and that's not just a visual thing. But you can see what Rush Limbaugh is doing. Well, if you made a hierarchy of prominent Republican faces, Trump, of course, would be at the top now. But, you can imagine, I think you'll find a lot of terrible people I wouldn't want in my family. You wouldn't want in yours. I mean, I'd be okay having W in my family in the way he is now, but we know more about him now. No more than if he had just been that frat boy. We know that when he was president, he was willing to throw away national unity in order to exploit the trauma the country had just been through in 9/11. I talked about that in a previous tape. That people seem to have forgotten that, but it was right out there what he did. Something not okay there. But he seems like a sweet guy now. I had a friend who was in the business of treating people for drugs and alcohol abuse, and I believe that he was somewhat expert in understanding the problems in the world of alcohol. I don't know that he was right about this, but he said to me, again, based on his knowledge as a professional, that he thought that that W. Bush, the second President Bush, was a dry drunk. And I pumped him about what exactly does a dry drunk mean, and I Googled the dry drunk, and I'm hoping I can remember exactly what the basic point is. But as somebody who never really confronted their problem, they stopped drinking, but they'd never gone through the healing process. Now, I don't understand the alcoholic disease well enough to know exactly what gets broken and what gets healed. Heal having to do with the word whole. But it makes a kind of a sense to me now that I see that away from the wielding of power, George W. Bush is an unhealed but decent guy. But there is something about the possession of power that switched on another side of him. And I don't quite get that. I know he didn't have a real good relationship with his father because he was a screw up, I guess. And I suppose I'm imagining that his being a screw up in the eyes of his father helped feed him into drinking, which made him even more of a screw up. He was arrested, I think, for DUI and stuff like that. Al Gore never would have been arrested for DUI. At least I would bet that. He's a Boy Scout. And W was a screw up. But if he experienced paternal power as injurious, maybe when he got powerful, he got to be a real schmuck. That's my clinical imagination. By the way, clinical psychology and me have some history together. I'm not. My brother's a clinical psychologist. My first wife's a clinical psychologist. My daughter's a clinical psychologist. I have a good friend who's a clinical psychologist. I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I did study clinical psychology at the University of Chicago some, and I did practice as a intern clinical psychologist in the Alameda County mental health system, 1968 to 69. And I keep on trying to understand things in psychological terms because that was really what I was drawn to at the beginning. Before I got my calling, I thought that's where I was heading. I wanted to understand, basically, in psychological terms, what goes on in cultural phenomena. I was especially interested in religion and literature and the symbolisms used in political discourse. That's what I was thinking I was going to do before the idea that gave me that set me on my life's course, the parable of the tribes, came to me. So, at the psychological level, we humans can take in what other people are in a way that's more elemental to who we are than some of these more abstract things that are at stake. Like if you say things like the inequality between the richest and the rest is way greater, like 3 times as great as it was in the 1950s, and harkens back to, or maybe even exceeds, what was the case in the Gilded Age in the late 19th century. That means a lot to me. I mean, I'm steeped in this stuff, but I don't know how much it means to people who aren't always looking at history and society and sort of trying to read the forces. But if you look at the face of Rush Limbaugh sneering at liberals, and you consider the hypocrisy of Newt Gingrich, who's talking this way on the House floor about Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, while he's doing what he's doing behind the scenes, and then you look at the wanton way that Mitch McConnell was willing to do anything he could get away with to get more power, even if it violated all the norms of the Senate. It's been said about, what's his name, Mitch McConnell, that he's destroyed the Senate. I think in a meaningful way, it's true. I don't know enough about the Senate. I'd be interested in asking, for example, Lawrence O'Donnell, to the extent to which Mitch McConnell has destroyed the Senate. What are the chances of repairing it adequately? How long would it take? I don't know those things. But the Senate is really a sick place. I mean, there was a time that the filibuster was there for a particular kind of reason. Now, it's true that it got instituted for racist reasons, but putting that aside, not that it's nothing at all, not that it's nothing. Nonetheless, the Senate has a lot of business to do that's to which the racist requirements of the Jim Crow South do not apply. And the filibuster was not used the way we've seen it used in the last, since 2011, maybe. That is not how we use the filibuster. There is a purpose for the filibuster. It's got to do with, I think it stinks, period. Particularly, at least we know it stinks to the extent to which, as it is now constituted, it can be a weapon that's used to destroy the democratic process. The minority is able to dominate the majority in a way that's completely unacceptable. The minority should have some rights, and that's supposedly what the filibuster is there for. but not to rule, not to block everything. And now the Republicans under Mitch McConnell took what had been something that people used, in special circumstances, and changed the Senate, talk about destroying the Senate, into a place that nothing can move forward without 60 votes. There are 100 senators. Majority rule is what's supposed to rule the Senate. The filibuster is not law. It's not in the Constitution. A majority rules is basically in there as the principle that what decides what the Senate can do, but not with this filibuster where a mere Senate rule is allowed to turn majority rule into any 40 senators can frustrate the will of the majority. That's Mitch McConnell's doing. It's the Republicans in the Senate's doing. I don't think there's a graph about how often has the filibuster been used, and it just took off at a certain point. And I'm pretty sure that it was Mitch McConnell who was engineering that. It should be enough to have a majority. Maybe you can slow down debate, so the majority can't just ram it through everybody's throat, in a minute. Maybe they should be able to slow it down enough to make sure it gets discussed. But there's no way the minority is supposed to rule. Everything that we can see these rogues having done really is destructive of American democracy. They are the face of a destructive force, a coherent force that is consistently destructive in its impact. And you would expect a coherent force that consistently works to make things in the human world worse, which is a good description of evil. You would expect that when they took human form, or when they chose human channels, or brought certain particular human beings to the fore, it's indicative of the power situation that certain people rise to the top. Donald Trump would not have been the choice of the Republican base when Eisenhower was president. It is a reflection of the larger picture. And the picture of these rogues tells us the Republican Party's been taken over by a force of brokenness that shows us that sometimes in the human world, somehow a particular actor becomes not a mixture of the constructive and the destructive, like we've generally seen, but becomes a pure case of destructiveness. Now, two people I didn't put in the rogues gallery are the 2008-2012 Republican candidates for president. I see a lot of decency in both John McCain and I must say, though, that I saw them both sell their souls to get those nominations. They were willing to embrace a lot of crazy and destructive things in order to get the nomination. Now, I hold on to that moment in John McCain's race where, though I thought he had really not done himself proud the way he kissed up to W, who had treated him that way and had treated the nation that way, lying us into the war in Iraq. I think that the way he kissed up to, I think that was disreputable. But, okay, he sold his soul. I mean, a lot of people are, ambition is a problem for a lot of people. Not everybody makes the choice that Lynn Cheney made. And he wanted that nomination, and he got it. But while he was running, there was this time in the Twin Cities, up in the upper stands of some arena where he's holding a rally and walking around with a microphone, and talking with average citizens and rallying the Republican base. And this woman basically talks about Obama as some sort of a monster who's, a godless terrorist, whatever. I don't remember what the words were that she used, but she was buying into the demonization of the Democrats that was already well along before the 2008 election, thanks to Rove and Limbaugh and the like, and using propagandist techniques. And I was very happy to see that John McCain was still decent enough that even though most of the Republicans in the Rogues Gallery would have had no trouble using what that woman had said to smear Obama and demonize him, McCain stood up for Obama and said, "No, ma'am, that's not who he is. He's a good American, a good family man, a decent person." I don't remember, I wouldn't put McCain in he sold his soul. I don't like that politicians do that. But, one of the unfortunate things about being a Republican in this era is that it required people to sell their souls or surrender their ambitions. I wondered, I characterized my opponent when I ran for Congress, Bob Goodlatte, who, after he beat me, was appointed by the Republicans as the chair of the Judiciary Committee. And that from that position, starting in 2017, when Trump became president, he was just a good foot soldier for whatever was running the Republican Party. And he protected Trump even while Trump was showing himself as somebody that the chair of the House Judiciary Committee should be looking into because there are evidence of high crimes and misdemeanors from the beginning. It didn't take long before we got to Jim Comey being fired for impeachable reasons. But Goodlatte didn't do that. That was his responsibility, but he was just a tool, and he was willing to go with where the power was. And apparently, Trump seems already to have had a degree of power over the Republicans in Congress. I'm not sure about how much power he had, how soon. I know that toward the end of the year, I wrote a piece saying that I thought that the rational choice for the Republicans is to, cut their ties with Trump and let him go, forward on his own. They didn't. They protected him. I'm not sure why they made that choice. Maybe I misread what was the situation already between them. But there is the Republican Party, lacking principle, really quite morally bankrupt. And you can see that in the moral bankruptcy of all these people who are in the Rogues Gallery. It gives us a visceral feeling about who they are and who the party is. I think I said in an earlier video that I can imagine it being efficacious if the Democrats can find some sufficiently tasteful way to get people to picture or experience sort of viscerally or whatever it is, but to actually get it at an experiential level somehow what Donald Trump did to E. Jean Carroll. An event happened that is concrete. It's not like violating the rule of law. It's not like trying to overturn an election that was conducted legitimately under constitutional processes. It's something very fundamental, just like the faces of these rogues, but even grittier. It is knowable what happened to E. Jean Carroll, what Donald Trump did with his hand. There's a jury of average Americans that have heard that evidence. They found unanimously that the preponderance of evidence, a civil case, that happened the way she said. I don't have any question that it happened. I mean, if you hear the Access Hollywood tape, he bragged about doing that. So why wouldn't you believe her? And I believe her about how terrible an experience it was for her and how bad the consequences have been for her. She's vindicated, but she's not, she has not been spared some being violated and experiencing a lot of costs for her efforts to hold her violator accountable. Anyway, there's a human level that might help people understand what's on the ballot when we've got this super rogue heading the ticket, a guy who we know will run the Republican Party solely for himself, just like he's got the RNC to be his fundraiser now for his legal expenses. He'll make the whole government an instrument of getting what he wants for himself. He's shown that that's what he does. I think that what he did to E. Jean Carroll captures the essence of that guy. What he would do to the nation. I remember there were bumper stickers back in the Vietnam days. So LBJ is doing to the country what, whatever. Anyway, the idea that there's something sexually violating about the injury being inflicted by the guy in the White House. Well, that's what we can get Americans to sense, that he would violate us. He would violate whatever he felt like violating, because he's the kind of guy who would do that to a innocent, respectable, decent, white, middle-aged, was she? Woman. Accomplished, with whom he had scheduled an agreed meeting for her to interview him, that he would do that. So I'm very big on a lot of the abstracts. I'm that guy with the better human story and all those big picture things. But I think one of the ways of reaching the voters to help them understand that we're up against the Republican Party is now completely dominated by that ugly spirit. You can see it embodied in different ways in that rogues gallery. And the particular rogue who's heading the ticket in 2024 can be conjured up in a variety of ways, of which the E. Jean Carroll thing is only one. But I think that it'd probably be good to go for the visceral, for the portrait, that we see something like in human terms, in the kind of terms that human beings have been able to see things since long before there were constitutions or rules of law or democratic norms or democracy or fascism or tyranny. But there's always been a problem about cruelty, dominance, selfishness. I would tell the story about Mike Pence and how he ended up, all that he gave to Donald Trump up until he was told by the authorities he consulted that he could not do what Trump wanted. And so he obeyed his constitutional duty rather than help Trump steal an election. And after 4 years of, excuse me, what's the word? Sycophancy, brown-nosing, complete self-abnegation for a guy who's just the opposite of what Pence has always said that he believed in. After groveling all those years, he consults with Dan Quayle and he consults with Judge Luttig. They both tell him, you got to do what you got to do, and it ain't what Trump was telling you to do. Even after all those years, Trump is willing to send the crowd that's chanting, hang Mike Pence after that vice president. I mean, that conjures up an image of a real son of a bitch. I mean, how do you create more vivid portraitures of evil than what that particular rogue can be shown to have done? It's not coincidence that it's not like he's going to do marvelous things, but he treats certain individuals badly. I mean, I know some stories about LBJ and how he treated Lady Bird. There's a lot of cruelty there, it seems, but he was genuinely interested in doing good things for the country. And that's why he was willing to sign the civil rights legislation, even though he knew that he was throwing away the South. He thought for only a generation, he underestimated. But not Trump. With Trump, the guy who treated Mike Pence that way, the guy who did that to E. Jean Carroll, the guy who Pence's Homeland Security person can tell us about how he sacrificed American lives playing the pandemic for his own political advantage, didn't care about protecting the American people. Those kinds of images are really quite indicative of why this man should never be entrusted with the powers of the presidency. He is not what a president should be. Okay, so that's our challenge right now. The challenge in American democracy is to keep Trump out of power. We could talk about, is Biden the man to be the champion? Should he back down? Will he back down? Make room for somebody else? I'm a little troubled by that issue, but I'm fully ready to support Biden 100%. And I don't expect him to back down, and I'm not sure if he should. Maybe he should. Maybe he shouldn't. But in any event, whoever the Democrats put up, probably Biden, has to win. That's simply all it is. And so the business of people who believe in the good, I will say, which is power from the bottom up instead of from the top down, democracy versus fascism, is very much something that maps over what helps human beings survive and thrive versus what is destructive, good and evil. So that's our job. And it's part of a larger job that I try to show how the force of destruction rises when a creature crosses the threshold into civilization. And I hope that people will check out whether I'm able to put all these things together as I claim that I have. We need to reorder our civilization in the coming decades and generations in time to save ourselves from self-destruction. And a part of that is also the American crisis of saving American democracy from being overturned by the force of fascism, right now being led by Donald Trump. That's the job we got to do. And it's part of the whole job that the rise of civilization has confronted human beings with this challenge from the beginning, and it's been a very difficult thing, and we've got only so much time to actually rise to this occasion and knit together a civilization that can survive on this planet for the long haul. Thank you.